How silence became a strategic weapon. In a world obsessed with visibility, constant updates, and decisive announcements, silence feels like absence, like indecision, like weakness. But there are moments when saying nothing exerts more influence than any statement ever could, when restraint itself begins to shape outcomes in ways action cannot reverse. This was one of those moments. This story matters today because modern power no longer depends on who speaks loudest or moves fastest. It depends on who controls expectations, who allows uncertainty to linger just long enough for others to reveal their intentions, their fears, and their dependencies. Silence, when used deliberately, does not remove influence. It concentrates it. The decision to remain silent was not accidental. It followed a period when attention was intense, when pressure mounted for clarity, reassurance, and direction. Investors waited. Partners asked questions. Competitors watched closely, trying to interpret every delay as a signal of weakness or internal conflict. And yet, no explanation came. At first, the lack of response created discomfort. Markets dislike ambiguity. They fill gaps quickly, often with optimistic assumptions. That instinct worked against everyone watching, because in the absence of confirmation, they began projecting stability where none had been promised. Silence became a mirror. What unfolded next was subtle but decisive. Without guidance, others committed. They made plans. They allocated capital. They revealed priorities they would have otherwise protected. Each assumption hardened into exposure, all while the silent party remained unbound, uncommitted, and free to observe. The longer the silence held, the more information it extracted. Reactions replaced strategy. Interpretations replaced facts. And slowly, the balance of power shifted away from those demanding clarity toward the one who could afford to withhold it. Silence was no longer absence. It was leverage accumulating in real time. And as the pressure continued to rise, the consequences of that restraint began to take shape in ways no one had anticipated. As the silence stretched on, its effects became increasingly visible, not through what was said, but through how others began to behave in its presence. Uncertainty, left unresolved, forced competitors and partners to act without confirmation, to commit resources, timelines, and reputations based on assumptions they hoped would later be validated. In trying to reduce ambiguity for themselves, they exposed exactly how much they needed clarity. Markets attempted to interpret the quiet. Analysts speculated. Commentators filled space with theories. Some framed the silence as confidence, others as internal disorder, but all of them were guessing, and guessing is revealing. Each narrative signaled expectations, fears, and pressure points that would have remained hidden if reassurance had been offered early. Inside negotiations, the dynamic shifted sharply. Those seeking answers began to concede ground simply to move conversations forward. Deadlines softened. Terms became more flexible. Concessions were reframed as cooperation, all in the hope that engagement itself would provoke a response. Silence, by refusing to react, quietly set the tempo. What made this strategy powerful was its asymmetry. The silent party faced no immediate cost. They had prepared for ambiguity. Others had not. Every additional day without comment increased the urgency on one side while leaving the other untouched. Pressure became one-directional. Over time, behavior adapted around the absence of guidance. Plans were finalized without confirmation. Positions were taken without guarantees. Once committed, reversing course would be expensive, both financially and reputationally. Silence had pushed others to move first. This was not manipulation through deception. Nothing false was said. Nothing was promised and withdrawn. The advantage came from allowing uncertainty to do what it naturally does when left alone. It forces exposure. By the time the quiet began to feel unbearable to everyone else, it had already delivered its strategic value. The conflict reached its peak when the silence stopped being interpreted as a temporary pause and started being felt as a constraint that others could no longer work around. What had once been an uncomfortable absence of information became a source of real operational pressure, forcing companies, investors, and partners to confront decisions they had postponed in the hope that clarity would arrive in time. Now, clarity was no longer coming on their schedule. Inside organizations waiting for answers, tension escalated. Leadership teams debated whether to continue holding positions that depended on confirmation or to move forward without it. knowing that either choice carried risk. Delaying further meant losing momentum and credibility. Acting meant committing to assumptions that could not easily be undone. The silence had transformed optional decisions into forced ones. Competitors began making visible moves, not because conditions were favorable, but because uncertainty had become unbearable. Announcements were rushed. Partnerships were finalized prematurely. Strategic positions were taken to signal confidence rather than to reflect readiness. Each action revealed priorities and vulnerabilities that silence alone could never have extracted through negotiation. Meanwhile, the silent party remained untouched by urgency. They watched reactions compound. They tracked who moved first, who hesitated, and who overextended. The longer the quiet persisted, the clearer the landscape became. Pressure was no longer evenly distributed. It was concentrated entirely on those who needed answers. The emotional peak formed around a realization that could not be openly admitted. Silence had removed choice without ever issuing a demand. By refusing to respond, it forced others to reveal how dependent they were on validation they did not control. What felt like mutual uncertainty was, in reality, asymmetrical exposure. Attempts to regain balance came too late. Once positions were taken and commitments announced, leverage shifted permanently. Reversing course would signal weakness. Waiting longer would invite damage. Every path forward now carried cost, except for the one held by the party that had never spoken. The conflict was no longer about information. It was about who had been forced to act first. And in strategic environments, the first to move under pressure rarely sets the terms. By the time this became obvious, the silence had already done its work. The climax arrived the moment silence finally broke, not because words were spoken, but because by then they no longer needed to be. The market had already repositioned itself. Commitments had been made. Exposure had been revealed. And the balance of power had quietly shifted to the only side that had never been forced to explain, reassure, or react. When communication finally resumed, it carried weight precisely because it arrived after the pressure had done its work. Terms were no longer debated from equal footing. Conditions that once would have been resisted were now accepted as reasonable. What had changed was not the message, but the environment in which it was received. Silence had reshaped expectations long before clarity ever appeared. Those who had acted early felt the consequences immediately. Their positions were locked. Their flexibility was gone. They negotiated from exposure rather than strength, constrained by decisions made under uncertainty they had not controlled. What they gained in speed, they lost in leverage. The resolution was not dramatic. It was procedural. Agreements followed the paths already carved by earlier commitments. Outcomes felt inevitable rather than imposed. Silence had turned choice into consequence, and consequence into structure. This is why silence works as a strategic weapon, not because it withholds information, but because it redistributes pressure. It allows uncertainty to concentrate where urgency lives. It forces others to reveal how much they need resolution and how quickly they are willing to pay for it. In modern markets, influence often belongs to whoever can afford to wait without explaining themselves. Silence is not indecision when it is intentional. It is positioning. It creates asymmetry without confrontation and leverage without visibility. The most powerful moment wasn't when words were finally spoken. It was when everyone realized they had already acted without them. By that point, the outcome had been quietly decided. So what do you think? Are we repeating the same mistake again? How